At this point, we want to take a moment to talk about some of the most severe threats, most serious threats to the health of our ecosystems today. In other words, what factors contribute most to the loss of species in our world today? We divide these factors up into 4 different categories, the most important of which would be loss of or degradation of habitat. Then we also have introduction of non-native species, overexploitation, and pollution. Let's take a moment and talk about each of these today. So the most important factor that has influenced the decline in the most number of species, the highest number of species, is habitat loss or degradation. Habitat loss has affected species declines in many different areas of the world, and many different species have undergone declines as a result of habitat loss. So habitat loss takes several different forms. On the left-hand side of the slide, we see deforestation. On the top, we see roads that have been cut through a forest. Just below that, we see a forest that has been divided up into patches. And what we see in the natural world is that many organisms require large patches of forest or large areas of forest. And so when we divide a habitat up into small patches, it's much less valuable than when we have a large continuous area of habitat available. We also, in the bottom slide there, see very simply destruction of the forest, not dividing it into patches, not cutting roads, but just eliminating the forest. On the right-hand side of the screen, you may be a little confused as to why we have a picture of the dam at Lake Cumberland in Kentucky shown on our slide. And so, interestingly, the construction of this dam and all others like it have had a drastic negative impact on aquatic organisms over the past 60 or 70 years since the dam construction began in earnest in this country. And so, what's the problem with dams? Well, dams create something that we refer to as a reservoir. Now, commonly we will call these things lakes. Lake Cumberland, Laurel Lake, Harrington Lake, all these things we refer to as lakes are in fact simply reservoirs. A reservoir is a large body of water that's created by a dam placed across a river. And so reservoirs are harmful to most organisms for this particular reason. Let's pretend you live above the dam in the stream before the dam is closed. You might be a little fish like this greenish fish that we see in the middle bottom slide, middle picture at the bottom of our slide. This is a greenside darter, scientific name Ethiostoma blenioides. And so this is a darter that gets to be about 4 or 5 inches long and lives in clean, clear, swift-flowing water at the bottoms of shallow creeks. It's very widespread in Kentucky. And so when you build a dam and you convert this shallow stream into a 50 to 100 foot deep lake, this darter, this particular fish, has no chance of surviving. And so it will be completely extirpated, or it will be extinct from that local area right above that dam. Now these reservoirs are quite extensive. Some of them extend over 100 miles above the dam. And so when you start to talk about all the reservoirs that have been constructed in the southeast, you realize that a large percentage of habitat, aquatic habitat, has been lost as a result of this dam construction. We also have something on the bottom right-hand side of our screen, and what we see there is a freshwater clam or mussel. And so, interestingly, these freshwater mussels have been so hurt by the construction of reservoirs that there are more of them on the endangered species list than any other group of organism that we find in North America. These mussels are very sensitive to environmental change, and when you build a dam and you bury them under 50 feet of water, they have no chance of surviving. It should also be noted that they rely on fish species to reproduce, and so the first part of the mussel life cycle is parasitic. In fact, when you look at that mussel in the bottom right-hand picture, what is showing there is a fish mimic. That's actually part of this female mussel's, what we call the mantle, the body of the mussel. And so she's trying to trick a fish to come along and bite that fish mimic. And if that fish does so, she'll spew her offspring in its face. And those offspring will grab onto that fish and hold on for several months during the first stage of their life cycle. So, reservoirs are very harmful to native organisms. Now, they're very good for some large game species like largemouth bass and striped bass, smallmouth bass. But there's only a small number of species that can do well in reservoirs, and they are fish that we like to fish for, and so that's a good thing. But in our streams in central Kentucky and throughout the southeast, we have a large number of species. Just in Jessamine Creek, we have at least 27 species of fish, which is what a recent study revealed. And so many creeks will have more species than just this. And we're just talking about fish species there too with that number 27. And so when we build a dam, we eliminate all those species and create good habitat for just one or two species. So habitat loss is a serious threat to organisms today. Habitat loss also happens through fragmentation, as we mentioned earlier. And so habitat that is cut up into small fragments is much less valuable for a number of organisms than is a large continuous piece of habitat. So organisms such as a bobcat, or even more so a cougar, which we don't find in the eastern United States, but we do find in the west. These are organisms that require huge home range, hundreds of square miles in some cases, to roam and hunt. And so when we fragment habitat up into small patches, it's not useful for those organisms. Another thing that's had a drastic negative impact on our native species is the introduction of exotic species. And so when we take an organism and introduce it into a new area, then we don't know what effect it's going to have on the species present there. So we have several examples of this. We have zebra mussels, shown in the top picture on this slide. Zebra mussels were accidentally introduced into the Great Lakes in ballast water of ships. And zebra mussels are very tiny mussels. So we see there's one, in this top slide, there's one big native freshwater clam, and then there's probably 20 zebra mussels stuck on this freshwater clam. And so zebra mussels have taken over everything. Zebra mussels kill these native mussels by attaching to them and preventing them from opening so that they just simply can't feed. Zebra mussels compete with some of our other native mussels for food. They're filter feeders, and zebra mussels are spreading, even today, down the Ohio River and becoming more and more common. Another introduced species that competes with native species is kudzu. And so if we look at the bottom picture here, we see kudzu that's taken over a house. Kudzu is an amazing plant that can grow at this incredible rate of supposedly up to 1 foot per day. And kudzu was originally introduced to control erosion along roadsides, which is a good idea. It does that, but it grows so quickly it tends to take over everything. It simply will cover up trees and prevent the trees from getting light and kill the trees in that particular way. Another example of an introduced species that is a very extreme example is the rabbit in Australia. And so rabbits were introduced into Australia accidentally, and rabbits just ravaged large parts of that continent, as you can see in this picture on the upper left-hand side of the screen. Rabbits reduced large areas of Australia to a desert-like consistency. They did everything they could to try to get rid of the rabbits. They had big plows that they pulled behind bulldozers to kill the rabbits in their burrows, which sounds pretty cruel, but they just needed to get rid of these rabbits somehow to save their farmland. They shot the rabbits, they poisoned the rabbits, but nothing was sufficient. And eventually they got the rabbits under control by introducing a virus that killed the rabbits. And so 90-something% of the rabbits died following the first introduction of that virus. Now the resistant rabbits survived, and the population started to come back, but now the rabbit population in Australia is kept under control by periodically introducing viruses that reduce the rabbit population greatly. So it's not as much of a problem as it once was, but it is still a problem. The picture on the right-hand side of the screen shows fences that were built across the entire continent of Australia to try to contain rabbits. These were met with limited success, but that shows the magnitude of this problem. They tried to build a fence across an entire continent to keep the rabbits from coming into that area of the continent. One other interesting example that we see on this slide are brown tree snakes. And so brown tree snakes were actually introduced onto the island of Guam, and as they have no native predators on the island, as introduced species frequently don't, they have spread out and reproduced and become very, very common on the island. The handful of snakes that's shown on the left-hand side of this screen are supposed to be the number of snakes that were caught in just one night of going out and walking around and looking for these brown tree snakes. Brown tree snakes are not venomous, or at least not venomous to a degree that's dangerous to humans, but they are annoying in some ways. And one thing that they do, they do prey on native organisms, and many of the songbirds on Guam have been decimated by the presence of these tree snakes. Another way that tree snakes are annoying, at least to humans, they're not killing humans, but brown tree snakes cause power outages. So you may realize that power is transmitted to houses using two electrical lines. The one on top is hot, and typically the one below it is a ground line. And as long as those two lines don't touch, everything's fine. But if something spans those two wires and touches them, then there's a tremendous jolt of electricity, and a fuse blows as a result of that. And so tree snakes very commonly crawl along one wire and then lower themselves down to the other wire. Now that, of course, kills that particular snake once it touches both wires, but it causes a power outage at that time, and so someone has to come back out and reset that large fuse housed in the electrical station. And so in the graph shown on the upper right-hand side of our slide, we see the number of power outages in Guam from 1978 until 1997, gradually increasing as the number of brown tree snakes increased. A final example of an introduced species, or perhaps two final examples, deal with fish. And so the first example comes to us from Africa. In Lake Victoria, Africa, we have this huge lake that has a remarkable, or at least had a remarkable diversity of a fish, type of fish referred to as a cichlid. That fish is shown in the upper right-hand picture on our screen. And people thought it would be a good idea to introduce a large carnivorous fish into this lake so that they could harvest it commercially, and so that people would pay to come and fish for a large fish that was exciting to fish for. And so they settled on the Nile perch, which is what the man on the left-hand picture is holding. Nile perch did very well in Lake Victoria, but as you would imagine, a fish that size can eat a number of cichlids in a day, and many of the unique cichlids that were found in this lake are now extinct as a result of the Nile perch introduction. On the bottom slide, we see one final example of a species that was hurt by an introduced species. The fish on the left-hand side of the screen is a brook trout. Brook trout are native to the southeastern United States, just to the mountainous areas, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Shenandoah National Park, the mountains of northern Georgia, all have brook trout. The trout that we see just behind the brook trout and to the right is a rainbow trout. Rainbow trout were introduced into the southeastern United States many years ago, about 100 years ago, by loggers, and rainbow trout are a little more competitive, a little more aggressive than our brook trout, and have replaced brook trout throughout much of their range today. Finally, we want to talk about another threat to species today, which is overexploitation. You might at first think this is the primary reason that species go extinct, but it's not. It is a problem, and has been a problem throughout history, but it's not as serious as is habitat loss or even the introduced species problem. Oftentimes, if a species is highly prized by humans, or if it, say, competes with humans, such as wolves, then it will be hunted or shot to the point where it actually becomes extinct, or at least very rare. So let's look at a couple of examples of organisms that have actually gone extinct. These are organisms that humans have hunted down and killed every last one of. If we look at the upper left-hand side of the screen, we see a Steller's sea cow, which was last seen in 1768. So the little man shown just below it represents the size of a person relative to a Steller's sea cow. Steller's sea cows are basically giant manatees. They are a close relative of the manatee, but much larger. And they were not very good at getting away from people. They didn't realize the danger and were easy targets for harpoons. They had useful fat, and their meat was also fairly good, and so they were killed relatively rapidly and didn't last very long once people came along. If we make our way to the right, we next run into the passenger pigeon. And there are two pictures of a passenger pigeon. One on the top, the black and white picture of a dove-like bird, and one on the bottom. On the bottom we see people shooting these birds up in the air. And so passenger pigeons were once so common that they darkened the skies. Very, very common in North America. As it turns out, passenger pigeons are good to eat, and as a result of that, they were widely hunted. And not only that, but we devised other ways to catch them with nets, and and various mechanisms so that we could catch more of them more quickly than just shooting them one by one. And believe it or not, we killed every single passenger pigeon. The last one died in 1914 in captivity, and passenger pigeons no longer exist on the face of the earth today. The great auk is shown as the penguin-like bird just to the right of the passenger pigeon. The great auk is that black and white bird that the man appears to be clubbing. This is just a simulation, as the great auk hasn't been around since 1844, when photography was not quite so far along. But the great auk was another bird that we hunted to the point of extinction. It wasn't very good at getting away from people, and was useful for food and for feathers, and so we used every single one. Finally, the Labrador duck that we see on the right-hand slide there is a duck that was popular for both its food and feathers, and was originally present in the northeastern portion of our country, but has been extinct since 1878. An animal that we almost drove to extinction, but not quite, was the buffalo. And so buffalo were very prevalent throughout much of the United States, as we can see in that map there on the lower right-hand side of our screen. The light tan color shows the original range of buffalo. And so buffalo once roamed all throughout Kentucky, and they're especially common in the Midwestern U.S. But when we figured out how to construct railroads and get out there to the Midwestern U.S., we harvested buffalo in huge numbers. And so what we see on the picture here is a pile of buffalo skulls, not bones, but just skulls. And so that's a tremendous number of skulls, as you can see there. We almost drove the buffalo to extinction, but we didn't quite get there, fortunately. And so now we have buffalo that do run wild in areas such as Yellowstone National Park in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. Finally, the last type of threat to biodiversity that we want to talk about today is pollution. And so pollution is defined as the release of poisons, toxins, or perhaps excess nutrients into the environment. Oftentimes we have organic pollution. So we may have excess fertilizer, for instance, that's placed on fields and yards and that runs off into our water, and that causes something called eutrophication. Eutrophication is the excess growth of plants and sometimes bacteria that leads to a reduction in oxygen levels in the water. You realize that plants do carry out photosynthesis, so they put oxygen into water, but at night they respire, which withdraws oxygen from the water. And then some of these plants are dying and falling to the bottom of the body of water and decaying. And as they decay, that decomposition process also uses oxygen. So eutrophication is a form of, organic pollution is a form of pollution associated with eutrophication. Pollution also comes in other forms, and so inorganic pollution is another type of pollution that can have many forms. And so some sort of toxin that's not carbon-based that's released into the environment. And so we have pollutants such as heavy metals, lead for instance, that may be released into the environment. We also have other sorts of toxins such as polychlorinated biphenyls, which are an example of a toxin that's widely used in industry. At least it used to be. It was banned in the early 1970s, but still there's a large amount of that particular pollutant in the environment. Things like PCBs, and to a lesser extent the metals, undergo something called biomagnification. Biomagnification occurs when organisms at higher levels of a food chain accumulate more of the pollutant. So let's look at the diagram shown at the bottom left-hand side of the screen. Here we see that algae, at the very bottom of the food chain, have a certain concentration, a relatively low concentration of the contaminant inside them. And so the contaminant is represented by the little dots in this particular case. Mayflies, a type of insect, eat algae their whole lives, and they accumulate that toxin in their bodies. Most of these toxins tend to stay in the cells of organisms and not move out. And so then fish come along and they eat those mayflies their entire life, and so they excrete all the parts of the mayflies, but the toxin remains in their bodies. And then say a heron comes along at the top of the food chain, eats a bunch of fish, and so it ends up with yet a higher concentration of this contaminant. So biomagnification can be a serious problem in the environment because on occasion humans have been exposed to high levels of contamination as a result of eating fish that reside at the top of the food chain. Finally, the last type of pollution we want to mention is acid deposition. Acid deposition occurs when emissions from factories go up into the clouds, interact with the compounds that are already in the clouds. They blow somewhere fairly distant from the factory, and then they rain down. And the rain that falls, it actually has a very low pH, sometimes in the range of 5. And so this is what we refer to as acidic deposition. Acidic deposition, or acid rain, is having a large influence on rather pristine, otherwise pristine areas, such as the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, especially at high elevations where the buffering capacity of the water and the soil is not very great. Much of the park is being affected by acid deposition that blows in from very distant areas where there is lots of industry. The picture we have at the bottom right-hand side of the screen shows the Cuyahoga River on fire in the 1960s. This is a picture that appeared in the front of Time magazine, and interestingly, this is a point at which we realize as a country that we need to start paying more attention to the cleanliness of our waterways. The Cuyahoga River was so dirty that it would periodically catch on fire and burn for days, which is what's depicted here, as a result of the oil and the sludge and just the trash that was floating on it. This particular picture began a process that eventually led to the passage of the Clean Water Act in the early 1970s. And the Clean Water Act sets regulations on how much pollution can actually be released into our waterways. And as a result, our water today is much cleaner than it was before the passage of the Clean Water Act.